Baby girl found a German shepherd trapped inside a wooden crate. What she did next left all crying. Sometimes, the smallest voices speak the loudest truths. What this little girl did for a stranger, not even human, shocked an entire city and reminded us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they wear muddy shoes and carry broken souls in their tiny arms. Like, share, and subscribe if this story touched your heart. The late afternoon sun hung low over the quiet American town, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. The houses along the narrow street looked tired but peaceful, their porches lined with rocking chairs, their windows glowing faintly with the promise of supper being made inside. Down by the edge of the street, where a weathered white fence leaned slightly from years of storms, a small child played alone. She was only 3 years old, a baby girl in a faded blue dress, her soft curls catching the last light of the day. In her tiny hands, she clutched a worn doll with button eyes and a loose ribbon bow. Sitting near her grandfather's porch, she hummed softly to herself, pushing her doll in an imaginary stroller drawn in the dirt. For a moment, everything was still. The only sounds were the creak of the porch swing above her and the gentle sigh of the evening breeze carrying the smell of pine and wood smoke. Then it came. At first, it was so faint it could have been mistaken for the chirp of a restless cricket or the croak of a distant frog. A scratching sound, muffled and uneven, carried on the wind. The little girl paused, tilting her head. There it was again, scratching, and underneath it, the softest whimper. Not a bird, not a frog. Something else. Her brow furrowed. She looked toward the trees, then back at her doll, as if asking it whether she had imagined it. But when the sound came again, longer this time, broken by a pitiful cry, her small body rose instinctively. She clutched her doll against her chest and followed the sound. Her tiny shoes crunched over gravel, then onto grass damp with evening dew. The sound led her behind the old shed, a place long forgotten, its boards gray with rot, its roof sagging under years of neglect. That's when she saw it. A wooden crate, half hidden by weeds and leaning against the shed wall, trembled. The sound was coming from inside, claws scraping, a muffled cry pressing through the gaps in the planks. The little girl froze, her wide eyes filling with something deeper than fear, curiosity, sadness, and compassion all at once. Slowly she stepped closer. The crate shifted with another desperate thump, as if the creature inside was fighting to breathe, fighting to be free. She could hear the rhythm of its struggle now, the frantic thuds, the labored gasps. Her small hands, trembling, reached out. She pressed her palm against the rough wood. The splinters bit at her skin, but she didn't pull away. She leaned closer, her lips parting with a whisper only a child could offer, "Shoo, it's okay." For a moment, the world fell silent. The scratching stopped. The cries faded into a soft, quivering breath. On the other side of the crate, the trapped creature had heard her, and answered not with thrashing, but with stillness, as if her innocent voice had carried something stronger than fear. The little girl's eyes welled with tears she didn't fully understand. She didn't know what was inside or why it had been locked away. All she knew was that there was pain here, hidden inside a box no one had cared to open. And with the simple touch of her hand, a fragile connection had been made, the smallest of hearts reaching out to the most broken of souls. It was the beginning of a story that would change the town forever. The crate was old, but not old enough to have been forgotten by time. Its planks were splintered and uneven, as though hammered together in haste. Rusty nails jutted out from the edges, catching the dim evening light like cruel teeth. The boards bore the stains of water and dirt, and the faint marks of claws dragged desperately along the inside. Every few seconds, there came the sound again. A scraping, then a muffled whimper, so faint that most grown ears would have dismissed it as nothing more than the creak of wood settling. But not hers. The little girl, no more than 3 years old, pressed her ear against the crate. Her tiny hands brushed over the rough planks, her skin nicked by a splinter, but she hardly noticed. She could feel the vibration of life inside, a trembling against her palm that made her eyes widen with both fear and wonder. Clutching her doll tighter in one hand, she turned and ran, her little shoes pounding over the grass, her curls bouncing against her cheeks. "Grandpa! Grandpa!" Her voice, usually soft and hesitant, broke through the stillness of the porch where her grandfather sat whittling a piece of wood. He looked up, startled. The child rarely raised her voice. His weathered face, lined with years of work and wisdom, grew tense as he set down the carving knife. "What is it, sweet pea?" he asked, rising slowly. His joints ached, but her urgency pulled him to his feet. She grabbed his hand and tugged with surprising strength for her tiny frame. "Come," she pleaded, pointing behind the shed. Her blue dress fluttered in the evening air, and the seriousness in her eyes silenced any further questions. He let her lead him, his old boots dragging across the grass. As they rounded the shed, he stopped dead in his tracks. There was the crate. At first glance, he thought it just an old carpenter's box left to rot, but then he heard it, the whimper, the scratching. His heart dropped. "Lord have mercy," he muttered under his breath, crouching down. He pressed his weathered hands against the wood, feeling the shiver of life inside. A chill spread through him, not from the evening breeze, but from the realization that this was no accident. This box had been built to hold something, someone. The child crouched beside him, her wide eyes filled with tears. She placed her tiny hand on a crack in the wood, whispering softly, "It's okay." As if on command, the frantic scraping inside stilled. For a moment, there was only silence. The grandfather looked at her, astonished. "You felt it too, didn't you?" he whispered. She nodded solemnly, her curls brushing against her cheeks. With trembling hands, he reached for the small crowbar he always kept in the shed. He wedged it between two planks and heaved. The crate groaned, the rusty nails screaming against the strain. After a few moments, a sliver of light pierced through the gap, illuminating a pair of desperate eyes staring back at them. They were the eyes of a German shepherd, glassy with exhaustion yet still burning with a plea for life. The dog's fur was matted, its muzzle pressed tightly against the narrow opening, panting heavily. The girl gasped, her free hand reaching instinctively toward him. The shepherd whimpered, and instead of snapping or recoiling, he pressed his nose as close as he could to her tiny fingers. A fragile trust formed in that single touch. The grandfather's throat tightened. Someone had put him here. Someone had locked a living creature into this prison, left him to starve, to suffocate in the dark. The anger in his chest was tempered only by the small hand that now stroked the plank gently, whispering comfort. The girl's cries soon carried across the evening air, thin and trembling. Neighbors, drawn by the sound of a child's distress, began to drift over. First one, then another, until a small crowd gathered behind the shed. Whispers rose among them. "What's in there? Did she find something? Good heavens, is that a dog?" When the light caught the shepherd's eyes through the crack, gasps rippled through the group. Some backed away nervously. Others leaned in, pity etched across their faces. But one thing was certain. The sight of the baby girl's tiny hand pressed so calmly against the box while the dog's frantic movements eased was something no one could ignore. The grandfather looked up at them, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. This wasn't an accident. Someone built this crate, someone locked him in here. He's been crying for God knows how long. And my granddaughter heard him when no one else did. The murmurs grew louder, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others frowning at the cruelty revealed before them. The little girl, oblivious to the debates around her, kept her eyes locked on the shepherd. Each time she whispered softly, the dog stilled, as though her innocence alone was stronger than all his pain. "Easy, boy," the grandfather murmured as he adjusted the crowbar. The nails groaned again, one snapping free, then another. He pried harder, sweat beading his forehead. Finally, a wider gap opened, enough for the shepherd's paw to slip through, thin, muddy, trembling. The little girl reached out and wrapped her tiny fingers around it. The onlookers fell silent. No one moved, no one spoke. The bond was undeniable. The dog, beaten and broken, found peace in the grasp of a child who knew nothing of cruelty, only compassion. In that moment, the crate was no longer just wood and nails. It was a symbol of suffering, yes, but also of hope. Because on the other side of its prison walls was a little girl who would not let go, and a town that would soon have to decide whether to walk away or to fight for the life she had discovered. The crate rattled again as the shepherd pressed his body against the wooden walls, a muffled cry breaking through the cracks. By now, half the neighborhood had gathered behind the shed, lanterns flickering in trembling hands as the sun dipped behind the hills. The little girl sat pressed to the crate, her cheek against the rough wood, her small hand reaching through a gap to touch what little of the dog she could feel. The sound of her sobs pierced the evening air, raw and innocent, and it was those tears that had drawn the townsfolk. But as the crowd thickened, so did the voices of doubt. An older man with a wide-brimmed hat, who had once captained the mill team, folded his arms and shook his head. "It's too dangerous," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "None of you know how long that animal's been in there. Half mad from hunger, no doubt. You pry that box open, and you'll unleash trouble you can't put back." A woman clutching her shawl closer nodded nervously. "He could be feral, diseased. What if he carries something? We've got children here. He could bite before anyone can stop him." Her words seemed to find foothold in others, and soon the murmurs spread like wildfire. "Maybe it's safer to leave him. He's been locked away for a reason. No telling what kind of beast waits inside." The grandfather, who had knelt with his crowbar poised to strike the nails, lifted his head. His weathered face, lined by years of sun and toil, bore the authority of someone who had built this very town with his hands. His voice, though quiet, rolled through the crowd with the steadiness of a hammer on wood. "No creature deserves to suffer in a box." The murmurs faltered. His eyes, darkened with both sadness and resolve, swept over the gathered neighbors. "I've spent my life raising barns, fixing fences, carving wood to make it last through storms. I know the feel of boards meant to protect and boards meant to trap. This," he tapped the crate with the crowbar, "wasn't built to shelter. It was built to bury, to silence. And you're telling me we should stand here and watch a life fade away because it's easier?" But fear, once planted, resists reason. A man near the back called out, "What if it attacks the child? You all saw how wild it thrashed. You think her tiny hand will keep it calm once it's free?" The child, as if answering, pressed her palm harder against the crack in the crate. The shepherd's breathing, which had been ragged and frantic, slowed to a low whimper. His nose nudged against her fingers, and for the first time since the cries had begun, silence filled the box. The little girl's tears spilled freely down her cheeks, but her voice was gentle when she whispered, "It's okay, we're here." A hush fell. The villagers shifted, unease and shame mingling in the cool evening air. They had all seen it. The change, the stillness, the way the broken animal inside responded only to the child's touch. The grandfather placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, steadying himself as much as her. "Look at her," he said softly, his voice breaking just enough to show the truth in it. "That dog isn't raging. He isn't fighting. He's listening. Listening to a child who doesn't know fear, who only knows compassion. And if she can see past the scars and the darkness, then why can't we?" No one answered. A lantern hissed as the oil wick burned low, and the orange light wavered over guilty faces. A woman lowered her eyes, whispering, "She'll remember if we turn away. She'll carry it forever." The fisherman who had first argued against the rescue rubbed his beard and sighed. "We free him," he said at last, "but carefully. Ropes, lanterns, tools ready. If he turns, we control him. But we don't leave him." One by one, heads nodded. The tide was shifting. The fear that had hung over the crowd began to thin, replaced by something heavier: responsibility. They had been on the verge of abandoning a life to rot in silence, and the thought sat bitter in their throats. The child's tears had stripped away excuses, leaving only the truth. They couldn't call themselves decent people if they let that box remain sealed. "All right then," the grandfather said, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "We do this together. Slow, careful, but we do it." Lanterns were set down in a circle around the crate, throwing long shadows against the shed wall. The wood glistened where the girl's tears had darkened it. Ropes were uncoiled, hammers readied, and crowbars exchanged between rough hands. Even those who had spoken harshly now stepped forward, unable to stand idle any longer. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled them. Something greater did. The little girl hadn't moved from her spot. Her doll lay forgotten in the dirt, her entire world narrowed to the trembling creature in the dark. She whispered again through the cracks, her voice as fragile as it was steady, "Don't be scared. We'll help you." Inside the box, the shepherd shifted, pressing his nose once more against her hand. For a brief moment, everyone could see it, the unspoken bond, the fragile thread of trust woven not by logic or debate, but by the innocence of a child's compassion. And with that, the decision was sealed. The grandfather rose slowly, crowbar in hand, and nodded toward the men around him. "Let's bring him back to the light." The crowd, once divided by doubt, now moved as one. Fear still lingered, but it had been overtaken by something far stronger: the unwillingness to let suffering go unanswered. And as the first nail groaned against the pressure of the iron bar, the little girl's small hand remained pressed against the crate, steadying the heartbeat inside, promising that he was not alone. The night pressed in heavy and silent, broken only by the shuffle of boots on soil and the occasional creak of tools being set into place. The crate, dark and splintered, sat like a coffin at the edge of the shed, its rough planks trembling with the faint movement of life inside. Men gathered around it with crowbars, hammers, and old rusted nails they had brought from their barns. The lanterns swayed gently in the cooling wind, casting long, quivering shadows that made the scene appear almost otherworldly. The grandfather knelt at the head of the box, his gnarled hands wrapped tightly around the crowbar. "Easy," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "The wood is old, but nails like these don't give without a fight." Beside him, two younger men braced their tools beneath the lid, their knuckles pale in the dim lantern glow. With every strike of the hammer, a metallic ring echoed, followed by the sharp groan of nails resisting their pull. It was as though the box itself was determined to keep its prisoners sealed away. The little girl, too small to understand the mechanics of iron and wood, had crawled close to the side where the cracks ran widest. Her blue dress brushed against the dirt, her doll abandoned somewhere behind her in the shadows. She pressed her cheek against the wood, whispering softly, "Don't be afraid. We're coming." Her words, though fragile, seemed to travel into the darkness of the crate. The German shepherd shifted, letting out a soft whimper. The townsfolk paused, their tools still mid-swing. For in that moment, the faint sound of trust broke through the suffocating air. The child's tiny hand slid into the narrow gap. The pause. Then an answer. A warm tongue, rough and trembling, brushed against her fingers. The dog's strength was failing, yet he chose his final reserves not for escape or thrashing, but for connection. He licked her hand again as if to say, "I know you mean no harm." A hush spread across the gathered neighbors. Even the skeptics, those who had moments earlier argued for caution, stood silent, staring at the impossible tenderness of the scene. The grandfather's throat tightened, his eyes burning. He struck harder at the wood, each swing fueled not just by duty but by urgency, by the knowledge that innocence itself had built a bridge no one else could. The wood split with a sharp crack. A gasp rose from the crowd. Another strike, and then another. The planks began to shudder, nails squealing as they were pried free from years of rust and neglect. Sweat beaded on foreheads, shirts clung to backs, but still they worked. Each sound of tearing wood was met by the baby's whispers of comfort, steady and gentle, as though her voice alone kept the shepherd from collapsing into despair. Finally, with one last wrench, the crowbar ripped free a plank. The opening gaped wide, and lantern light spilled inside. Eyes stared back, hollow, desperate, yet glimmering faintly at the sight of freedom. The crowd leaned forward. The shepherd, ribs protruding beneath his matted fur, pressed against the gap, trembling legs quaking with the effort. His muzzle broke through first, then his chest, until at last, with one final push, the broken box surrendered him to the world outside. He stumbled forward, collapsing onto the ground in a heap of fur and bones. His sides heaved as though every breath was a mountain, his paws shaking under the weight of exhaustion. Mud clung to his coat, and blood streaked his fur where splinters and rusted nails had scraped him raw. For a heartbeat, the crowd only stared, frozen between awe and sorrow. Then the baby girl, her cheeks wet with tears, clapped her tiny hands together. "Doggy," she cried through sobs. It was the first laugh, the first bright sound to leave her lips in weeks, since the shadows of grief had stolen her joy. The grandfather's hammer slipped from his hand as he turned to look at her, his heart swelling. Her giggle, though broken by tears, was like a bell cutting through the gloom. It wasn't just the shepherd being saved, it was her too. The dog lifted his head weakly at the sound, his ears twitching, his gaze settling on the small figure in the dirt. He tried to rise, his legs trembling beneath him, but only managed a half-step before collapsing again. His muzzle stretched toward her, as if she were the only anchor keeping him tethered to life. The grandfather dropped to his knees beside the animal, one hand brushing carefully over its side, feeling the harsh rhythm of its breathing. "He's starving," he muttered, his voice tight. "Starving and half-broken. But he's still fighting." "Get blankets," someone called. "And water, bring water." Lanterns shifted as villagers ran to and fro, fetching whatever they could. The women huddled close, laying old quilts across the shepherd's frame, while a boy brought a bucket of water that sloshed onto the ground as he set it down. Yet even as they worked, the shepherd barely moved. His eyes fluttered, his chest rose and fell unevenly. The child pressed closer, her small hands brushing over his paw. "It's okay," she whispered again, as though repeating the words could keep him awake. His eyes flickered, and though his body sagged against the earth, a soft rumble left his chest, not a growl, but the faintest sigh of relief. "Lift him," the grandfather ordered at last, rising with urgency. "He won't last the night out here. The barn, it's warmer there." Several men stooped, their hands sliding gently beneath the shepherd's body. He groaned, but too weak to resist, he let himself be carried. The crowd parted, lanterns swinging to light the path as they moved toward the old barn that sat at the edge of town. The baby girl toddled behind them, her steps quick, her blue dress trailing in the dust, her tiny hand clutching the shepherd's paw until she could hold it no longer. Inside the barn, straw was spread across the ground, and the men lowered the dog onto it with care. He lay motionless, chest rising slowly, eyes half-lidded. The villagers lingered at the doorway, their voices hushed, as though in the presence of something sacred. The grandfather stood over the shepherd, his weathered hand resting gently on the animal's side, while the little girl crouched down, her doll forgotten in the corner. She leaned in close, pressing her forehead against the shepherd's, whispering one final promise for the night. "We'll help you." And though the shepherd's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, they closed with the faintest trace of peace. The barn was hushed that night, its wooden beams creaking softly in the breeze, as though the structure itself sensed the fragile presence of a life clinging to its last threads. The German shepherd lay on a bed of straw, his sides heaving shallowly, each breath rasping as though dragged from the depths of pain. Lanterns flickered against the barn walls, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the rhythm of his suffering. The child knelt beside him, her small knees pressing into the straw, her eyes wide with both wonder and grief. She didn't flinch at the sight of his ribs pressing sharply through his skin, or the scars that marred his coat like a map of forgotten battles. She only reached out, her tiny fingers brushing across the matted fur, whispering words that no one else could hear. By dawn, the grandfather had summoned the town's old veterinarian, a silver-haired man named Dr. Harris, who arrived carrying a battered leather bag. His face hardened when he saw the shepherd, and for a moment, even his years of experience seemed not enough to mask the sorrow in his eyes. He set down his tools with care, knelt beside the animal, and began his examination. The hush deepened as the townfolk gathered at the barn doors. The doctor's hands moved with steady precision, probing along the shepherd's spine, tracing the ridges of bone too sharp for comfort. "Starved," he murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. He pushed back the fur along the shoulders, revealing raw marks hidden beneath. Whip scars, old but deep. Someone did this deliberately. His fingers brushed along the chest, stopping at the faint line of puckered skin. And here, rope burns as if he fought chains. The crowd stirred uneasily. Mothers drew their shawls tighter around their shoulders. Men shifted on their feet, unable to meet one another's eyes. Suffering was something they knew in pieces, but cruelty, this kind of cruelty, left them silent. The grandfather swallowed hard. Locked in a box, beaten, starved, his voice broke. And still he licked her hand. He gestured toward the toddler, who sat cross-legged in the straw, gently pressing her palm against the shepherd's paw. The dog did not resist. In fact, his breathing eased, just slightly, when her touch lingered. From the back of the crowd, an old neighbor cleared his throat. His weathered face, lined with years by the river, was pale beneath the lantern light. "I know him," the man whispered. All eyes turned. He stepped closer, his boots dragging as if each step weighed upon his conscience. "That's Fisher's dog. Belonged to Henry and his wife years ago. Loyal as the day is long. Used to guard their children by the riverbank while Henry cast his nets." A murmur rippled through the barn. Some remembered the laughter of children skipping stones, the shepherd standing tall at their side, barking playfully when their feet strayed too close to the water. "What happened to them?" the grandfather asked, his voice low. The old neighbor sighed, the memory heavy. "They left after the accident. The river took their youngest boy during the storm. Henry never forgave himself. Packed up and left town. No one saw the dog again." His gaze fell upon the scarred shepherd, and his lips trembled. "I thought he died with them, but here he is, alive, though barely. Abandoned, forgotten." The barn grew still, as if the river's sorrow had seeped into its walls. The child tilted her head, as though she understood every word of the story, though too young to know loss by name. She shuffled closer, her little dress brushing through the straw, and leaned down until her forehead rested against the shepherd's. Her voice was no louder than the whisper of the wind. "It's okay. You're safe now." The shepherd's eyes flickered open. For a heartbeat, the pain seemed to lift. His body remained broken, but something in his gaze softened, as though her words had reached the wounded part of him that no medicine could touch. The grandfather watched in silence, a thought carving deep into his heart. The broken crate wasn't just a prison of wood and nails. It was a symbol of trust splintered, of loyalty discarded, of a past fractured by human cruelty. But now, in the quiet presence of a child who knew no malice, perhaps that trust could be rebuilt. Dr. Harris offered a bowl of water, setting it down carefully by the shepherd's muzzle. The dog turned his head away. A plate of softened bread followed, but still the shepherd did not move, only closed his eyes as if retreating inward. A murmur of worry passed among the neighbors. "He's too far gone," someone whispered. The toddler shifted, looking up at the bowl. She glanced at her grandfather, who nodded silently. With clumsy hands, she dipped her fingers into the cool water, then held them out, droplets glistening in the lantern light. "Here," she said softly, the first clear word she had spoken all evening. The shepherd's nose twitched. Slowly, painfully, his tongue reached forward, lapping at the water from her tiny palm. A gasp swept through the barn. Hope, fragile and trembling, filled the air. Encouraged, she dipped her hands again, holding them out with a patience far beyond her years. This time, he drank longer, his breath steadier between gulps. Tears brimmed in the grandfather's eyes as he crouched beside them. He had seen miracles before, small and quiet, but never one like this. Not just a dog choosing to live, but a child choosing to give him reason. The townsfolk looked on, their skepticism dissolving into reverence. The child reached for a piece of bread, softened in warm milk, and held it toward the shepherd's muzzle. At first, he turned away, but when her tiny fingers brushed against his nose, he took it, gently, gratefully. Dr. Harris let out a long breath. If he'll eat from her, he can survive. But only her. The barn was silent, save for the soft sounds of the dog chewing, the child's whispers of encouragement, and the collective beating of hearts witnessing something extraordinary. The broken crate had birthed not just scars of the past, but the beginnings of healing. That night, as the lanterns dimmed and the townfolk drifted back to their homes, the child refused to leave the shepherd's side. Curled against the straw, she pressed her small body close to his battered frame, her hands still resting upon his paw. The grandfather draped an old quilt over them both, his heart swelling with equal parts sorrow and hope. "Sleep now," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Both of you." And in the stillness of the barn, beneath the weight of scars and sorrow, the faint rhythm of healing began. The days that followed in the little town unfolded with a tenderness that few could have imagined on the night the shepherd was pulled from his prison of wood and nails. At first, every movement the dog made was slow, labored, each step as if his body were still chained to the crate he had endured for so long. But there was one presence that seemed to cut through the fog of his suffering, the small girl in her blue dress. Wherever she toddled, he followed, his frail paws dragging, his ribs faintly showing beneath the recovering fur, but his eyes steady, always fixed on her. The townsfolk who passed by the barn would often stop, drawn by the sight of the unlikely pair. In the early mornings, when the sun lit the horizon in shades of pale gold, the child would tug along her old blanket, dragging it across the straw until she reached the shepherd's side. With tiny, careful fingers, she spread it over his back, whispering to him as though he were her baby. He would sigh, his ears twitching, and for the first time in many seasons, peace would settle across his scarred face. By midday, she shared with him what little she had, morsels of bread softened in milk, bits of apple from her small plate. The shepherd, who had refused food and water from others, ate gently from her palm, never biting, never rushing. To those who watched, it was as though his hunger depended not on the bread, but on the trust carried in her small hands. One afternoon, as her grandfather carved wood on the porch, The sound of laughter, light, high-pitched, unrestrained, spilled across the yard. Heads lifted from kitchen tables, hands paused in gardens, ears strained from windows. It had been months since anyone had heard such a sound from her. Ever since her mother's passing, the girl's world had been muted, her voice a whisper, her eyes dulled. But now, as the shepherd nudged her doll with his nose and she erupted into a fit of giggles, the sound returned, healing not just her, but everyone within earshot. Her grandfather set down his knife, his weathered hands trembling. He closed his eyes, letting the laughter sink into him like rain into dry earth. When he opened them again, tears glistened, but his heart was lighter than it had been in many moons. "You've given her back to us," he murmured toward the shepherd, though the dog simply pressed closer to the child, his gaze warm, protective, eternal. The change in the child and the dog rippled outward, touching the hearts of the townsfolk. Slowly, people began to visit the barn with small offerings, blankets folded neatly, baskets filled with food, jars of herbs for healing wounds. Mothers brought warm broth, children left toys by the straw, and even the stern men who had once doubted the shepherd's place now arrived with quiet apologies and pieces of firewood to keep the barn warm at night. It wasn't long before whispers began to travel beyond the town's borders. "The dog who escaped the box," they said. Farmers in nearby valleys, merchants on the dusty road, even travelers who stopped by the river carried the tale further. A dog once locked away, half dead in a wooden crate, had been saved by the tears of a child. Now he lived, not as a shadow of suffering, but as a living symbol of survival and loyalty. In the evenings, the barn glowed with lantern light as neighbors lingered after supper, sitting in quiet reverence around the pair. The little girl would toddle about, clutching her doll in one hand, pressing her other against the shepherd's fur as though he were her anchor to the world. And he, once a prisoner of silence, responded with patient devotion. If she stumbled, he steadied her. If she cried, he nuzzled her hand until her tears turned to laughter again. The grandfather, though humbled by the townsfolk's kindness, often stood back, his eyes misty as he watched. To him, the shepherd was more than a miracle. He was proof that broken things could be mended, that even in the wake of loss and cruelty, love could carve new paths. Each day he found himself whispering silent thanks, not just for the dog's survival, but for the way his granddaughter's smile bloomed again, fragile yet unstoppable, like wildflowers pushing through cracked stone. One chilly night, when frost began to creep across the barn windows, a stranger arrived at the town's edge. He had heard the tale on his travels, carried from voice to voice, each retelling more wondrous than the last. He stepped into the barn, hat in hand, and gazed upon the girl curled against the shepherd, both asleep beneath the patchwork blanket. "So it's true," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The child and the dog." Word spread quickly. What began as whispers had become legend. And with each telling, the meaning grew. To some, the shepherd was the embodiment of endurance. To others, the child's compassion was the miracle that bound them. But to those who lived in that small town, it was simpler and deeper. The box that had once held despair had given way to a bond beyond wood and nails. By winter's arrival, the shepherd's strength had returned in full measure. Though scars still traced his body, his gait steadier, his coat thickened with health. Yet he remained inseparable from the child, never straying more than a few paces from her side. Whether she sat on the porch, played at the river's edge, or fell asleep clutching her doll, his watchful eyes guarded her. And in turn, she cared for him in ways no adult could, small hands smoothing his fur, her laughter filling the void left by years of silence. It wasn't just survival. It was healing, mutual, complete. The child had given the dog back his trust, and the dog had given the child back her joy. Together they had done what medicine, prayers, and even time had failed to do. And so, under the watchful gaze of lanterns and stars, the people of the town began to call him by a name that echoed through the streets and across the valleys: the dog who escaped the box. To them, he was no longer just an animal rescued by chance. He was a testament to hope, loyalty, and the kind of love only a child could summon, a love that could unlock even the heaviest prisons. The winter had settled heavily over the small town, the lake now rimmed with ice, its surface holding the reflections of lanterns that dotted porches and barns alike. Life had found a rhythm again since the shepherd's rescue. The child's laughter returned each day, echoing across the yard like a melody the town had feared lost forever. People spoke of the dog who escaped the box, with reverence, as though he were not merely an animal but a living parable. And yet, just as peace seemed to have truly taken root, shadows crept in from beyond the valley. One frosted morning, when the townsfolk gathered at the square to exchange goods and share stories, a stranger appeared. His coat was heavy but frayed, his boots caked with old mud. His eyes were sharp, cold, with a bitterness that seeped into every step he took. In his hands he carried a worn leather satchel, and beneath his arm a roll of faded papers. He paused in the square, letting his gaze sweep across the people, until it fell upon the shepherd, lying at the little girl's feet. "There he is," the man muttered, his voice rough as gravel. "That's my dog." The words froze the morning chatter. The grandfather straightened, his brow furrowed. "Your dog?" he asked evenly. The stranger strode forward, his boots striking hard against the cobbled ground. "I raised him, kept him in that crate for training. He's mine by right, and I've come to take him back." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mothers pulled children close. Men exchanged uneasy glances. The shepherd stirred, his ears flattening, eyes narrowing as though he recognized the cruel tone. But the little girl dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, her tiny face pressed into his fur. "Training," the grandfather's voice thundered, disbelief cutting through the air. "You call starving him and whipping him training?" The stranger smirked, unfurling the papers in his hand. "Proof of ownership," he said. "Signatures. Records. Law's on my side, old man." He thrust the yellowed sheets forward. The crowd closed in, murmurs swelling. Some muttered that the law had to be respected. Papers were papers, after all. Others hissed with anger, remembering the scars carved into the shepherd's skin, the cries from the wooden crate that still haunted their nights. The divide grew sharper with each passing minute. Law versus morality, order versus compassion. And in the middle of it all, the toddler clung to the dog as though the earth itself might split and steal him away. Her sobs were soft but steady, pressing into the shepherd's ribs. Each cry seemed to melt the hearts of those who had once doubted, making even the sternest villagers shift uncomfortably. The grandfather raised his weathered hand. "We will not argue in the streets," he declared firmly. "Tonight at the lakeside hall, we settle this as a community." His voice carried the weight of decades, and the townsfolk nodded. The stranger gave a satisfied sneer, confident in his papers, in the cold grip of the law. That evening, lanterns glowed along the path to the lakeside hall. The building, usually reserved for celebrations and winter dances, now throbbed with tension. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, women clutched shawls around their arms, and children huddled close, their wide eyes reflecting the firelight. At the center of the hall stood the shepherd, thin but proud, with the toddler sitting cross-legged beside him, her doll clutched in one hand, her other hand gripping his ear as though holding fast to life itself. The stranger presented his case with booming arrogance. He waved his papers, stamped his boots, and repeated that the shepherd had been his property, trained for guard work, locked away only for discipline. He spoke of law, of rights, of contracts written years ago. His words were sharp, but each one landed like a stone on uneasy hearts. Then the grandfather rose. His voice was slower, steadier, but it carried an honesty that filled every corner of the hall. You call yourself an owner, but ownership does not mean cruelty. This dog was not trained. He was tortured. You left him to rot in a crate of splintered wood. If not for the cry of my granddaughter, he would have died unseen, unmourned. He turned, pointing to the child who now pressed her cheek against the shepherd's fur. And yet, here he is, alive only because of her innocence, her compassion. If law sides with cruelty, then the law has no place here. The hall erupted. Voices clashed, some in agreement, others in protest. "Property is property," shouted a man in the back. "Without law, we're nothing," another snapped. "And without mercy, we are worse than beasts." The debate swirled, heated, urgent, breaking the quiet rhythm of the town into something raw and unsteady. Through it all, the toddler sat silently, tears rolling down her cheeks, dripping onto the shepherd's matted fur. Her sobs were small, yet in their softness lay a force stronger than any shouted word. People began to falter in their arguments, their eyes lowering in shame. A hush began to fall, until the shepherd himself moved. With a slow, painful limp, he rose to his feet. Every scar, every wound bore witness as he crossed the hall. The child reached for him, her arms outstretched, her cries catching in her throat. And then, with all eyes upon him, the shepherd lowered himself before her and rested one paw gently in her lap. The hall went silent. No paper, no voice, no law could match the declaration carried in that simple act. Loyalty. The kind that no chain, no crate, no man could break. The little girl wrapped her arms around his neck, her sobs dissolving into quiet whimpers. And in that fragile embrace, the town saw the truth. The shepherd had already chosen his home. The grandfather's voice rose one final time. "Let us vote. Not on paper, not on chains, but on what is right." One by one, hands lifted. First a trickle, then a tide. Mothers, fathers, farmers, merchants, all in agreement. Even some who had wavered earlier found their hands rising, their eyes wet with tears. At last, the hall glowed not with lanterns, but with conviction. The verdict was clear. The shepherd would stay, with the child, with the grandfather, with the town that had found its heart again. The stranger's face darkened. He crumpled his papers in a fist, cursed the air, and stormed out into the night. The door slammed behind him, and the sound echoed like the last nail being driven out of a coffin, sealing the past, freeing the present. The townsfolk turned back to the child and her shepherd. They were no longer divided. They were whole, bound not by law but by compassion, by the courage of a toddler's tears and the vow of a scarred dog who had placed his paw into her lap. Sometimes the faintest cries are heard only by the smallest hearts. On that late afternoon, when a toddler's tiny hands pressed against the rough planks of a wooden crate, the world seemed to pause. In her innocence, she saw what others might have walked past. In her tears, she carried the weight of a truth that grown men and women had forgotten, that compassion is not weakness, but the strongest force of all. The German shepherd, scarred by cruelty and years of silence, became more than just a dog rescued from a prison of nails and splinters. In him, the town saw itself, wounded, divided, yet still capable of healing. His broken body mirrored their broken unity, and his survival became their chance to stitch together something greater than law, greater than fear. And at the center of it all was a child, a 3-year-old girl in a simple blue dress, whose innocence saved not just a life, but reminded an entire community of its humanity. Her small hands, offering food, blankets, and comfort, became the bridge between suffering and hope. The shepherd now walks the streets freely, not as a stray, not as property, but as a symbol of resilience. People call him the dog of the crate, but to the baby girl, he is simply her friend, the one who stayed when the world felt too heavy. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes loyalty never fades. Like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from. Because sometimes, the smallest voices remind us of the greatest truths, that love can break even the strongest chains.